Hello, friends. It's always hard to try and interrupt wonderful conversation that's happening. We already have a wonderful buzz in the room. It's not surprising because our dear friend Ronit Ricci is here. So Ronit has made me promise that I won't embarrass her. So I told her that I wouldn't do that. So I'll only tell you this much, that Ronit did her PhD here at Michigan in our Department of Comparative Literature, that she is now teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, but she simultaneously holds a position at the Australian National University. And I will tell you that she has a number of publications, but the one that I would like to mention is her monograph based on the dissertation that she wrote here and revised at the Institute for the Humanities, or finished writing at the Institute for the Humanities. And that book is called Islam Translated: Literature, Conversion, and the Arabic Cosmopolis of South and Southeast Asia. And the thing I'd like to say about the book, I don't have to say that much because I know there are a number of you in the room who have read the work at various iterations, perhaps, is that I've had the opportunity to teach this book now on a couple of occasions. And the most beautiful thing for me as a scholar is that on each iteration of reading the book, I have seen new depth, new dimensions, learnt more and differently. And quite honestly, that doesn't happen every day. It's a sign of Ronit's just wonderful scholarship. And so I won't say more. I'll welcome her to the Center for South Asian Studies for her lecture, Sarandib, Lanka, Ceylon, Banishment and Belonging. Please welcome Ronit Ricci.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Farina, for embarrassing me just a little. I want to thank the Center for South Asian Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature for supporting my visit, and thank you all for being here. I'm always very, very happy to come back to Ann Arbor. As some of you know, I spent 11 very significant years of my life here, and it always feels like coming home. And sometimes, in the spirit of my talk today, it feels a little bit like coming home from a place I've been banished to. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm recently trying to wrap up a research project that I've been working on for several years. And I'm also trying to put it all together into a book. And so my talk today draws on one of the chapters of this book, and I very much welcome any thoughts or feedback that you might have. So the small Indian Ocean island known as Sarandib, Lanka, and Ceylon has figured as an important site of banishment in different periods and different literary and religious traditions. My talk takes as its starting point the history of the Sri Lankan Malays, a community descended from 18th century royal exiles from across the Indonesian archipelago, soldiers in colonial armies, servants, convicts, and others sent to Dutch and British Ceylon. And I take this history as a starting point to consider if and how earlier traditions of banishment mattered to the Malays' images of and sense of belonging to this island. The three names and their exilic connections, as I see them, are, so the name Lanka, if we think about a religious and literary tradition that is related to banishment to Lanka, I'm thinking of the Ramayana, which unfortunately I won't have really enough time to speak about today. If we think about Ceylon, we can think about 18th century colonial exile and its narratives. And what I want to speak about in particular today is the Islamic tradition that views the island, which the Arabs knew as Sarandib, as the site of Adam's fall from paradise to earth, and the ways that ancient story helped frame and give meaning to exile in the colonial period. So this is a question both about exile and its echoes, the kinds of echoes the exile in the 18th century might have had in earlier literary and religious traditions, and it's also a question about practices of naming or nomenclature and how the same, quote-unquote, same place which is this place, which I purposefully put a map up here that does not include a name, evokes different images and stories as they relate to a shared theme. So my talk, and in some ways the book that I'm trying to write, are about fragments, about echoes, and about the imagination. And also, yeah, distance myself, okay. Oh, and it's also about prior text, which is a term that I borrow from Pete Becker, the late Pete Becker, who was my teacher and my friend here at Michigan. So it's also about prior text and their working. So how stories, words, characters circulate and transform depending on the site, religion, historical context in which they're evoked, and the particular pasts that they carry along with them. And within this broader phenomenon, I want to suggest that exile provides an especially poignant arena to explore such processes and imaginative recreations and expressions because of its particular dimensions of human struggle and endurance. Part of the reason these stories have remained with us for as long as they have. Oops. Okay. So at first, in order to give you just a tiny bit of context, I have to say a few words about the Sri Lankan Malays and their history, their literary history. If I had to give, really just a blurb about them, these are the sort of the facts that I would present. So this is a group of people who are living in contemporary Sri Lanka who have a diverse ancestry from across the Indonesian Malay world. Their forefathers, some of them were exiled to Ceylon under Dutch rule from the between the late 17th and late 18th centuries. Later on, Sri Lanka was taken over by the British in 1796, so under British rule there was no more exile, but there was recruitment to the colonial army, and many of them served in the British army. There was a special Malay regiment in which they served. And one of the main things that characterized and still characterizes them is the ongoing use of the Malay language for writing and speech. Nowadays, people very rarely write in the Malay language, but they still speak it at home. And over the years, over these several centuries, they've produced a large sort of corpus of writing. So I just wanted to show you a few images. It brings it alive sort of more than just listening to me speak. So this is the Vekande Mosque in Colombo. It's a mosque that was built in the late 18th century, one of the earliest mosques that the Malays built in Ceylon. And this is in the Javata cemetery. You can see the word Javata, it comes from Java. So, and you can see the Malay inscription on the tombstone. This is a more contemporary evidence of Malay life in Ceylon. This is Malay Street, also in Colombo, in the area where the barracks used to be of the Malay Rifle Regiment. These are just a few portraits of people, of course, because of you wouldn't expect people to all look the same or look similar, but when you see members of this community, you can really see features from that remind you of people from various places around the Indonesian archipelago, Malaysia, and of course also Sri Lanka itself. And this map shows the places where I went, because I did a project of surveying and documenting surviving Malay manuscripts and books and other documents in Sri Lanka. I went looking for these documents in order to have a basic database with which to work, and it was also an opportunity to preserve many of these materials by taking digital photos, and if the archive is now on the British Library website if anyone is interested. So it was to create a data base for myself, but also hopefully for others who might be interested in studying the history or the culture or the language of this community. And this is the final image from this series, and I like it because I think it's sort of a metaphor for my own research on this subject, but maybe also for research in general, where you're sort of sitting in the dark and you have lots and lots of little pieces and you're trying to gradually bring them together and make them fit with each other, and they never quite fit, but gradually, or they don't, you don't get the perfect picture, but gradually you have more and more light, and you hopefully can say something about the bigger issue or the bigger question. So this is actually a marriage contract in the Malay language that was found lying inside a different book, not even a Malay book, and it explains about the bride and the groom, where their families came from in the late 19th century. So this is just a very, very brief introduction, but I'm happy to answer any questions about, you know, this history later on, but I just don't have enough time to talk about it at length. So in my talk, I want to take a look at the foundational Muslim tradition, Adam's banishment from paradise and his fall in Sarandib, known from early Arab sources and widespread in Muslim South and Southeast Asia, as a starting point to explore the relevance of Adam's fall to Sarandib to colonial exile in Ceylon. So how might have this ancient tradition of banishment informed experiences and memories of more recent exile? And rather than approach this question, as well as the story and its transmission in a chronological manner, I try in this talk to weave my way through different periods, places, and languages, early Islamic works written by Arab and Persian scholars in the 10th to 12th centuries, a 20th century Malay poem from Ceylon, a 14th century travelogue, a series of tales from 18th century Java. What I'm trying to do is, rather than talk about it sort of in a linear fashion, is to invoke the movement of Adam's story and its manifestations in different genres and contexts. And you can tell me at the end if this works or if it's better to stick to the linear model. The story of Adam's fall constitutes a religious and textual tradition in which Sarandib, the Arab name for Lanka, was the site of exile of the most fundamental kind, banishment from the realm of the divine to human life and suffering. This primordial exile was God's punishment for Adam and Eve's disregard towards the command to never approach the forbidden tree. I assume that most people are familiar with this story, its basic contours. Tricked and tempted by Iblis, who is the figure of Satan, the two tasted the forbidden fruit, resulting in their expulsion from paradise, an event that would have profound implications for all of humanity. The tradition that Adam, first man, and also, according to Islam, the first prophet, fell in Sarandib may derive from a very early Christian source. It's not entirely clear, but it gained traction and fame within Arabic and wider Islamic literature. Although the specifics of Adam's fall are not recounted in the Quran, the story appears already in the writing of early geographers and historians, including the 10th century Persian scholar al-Tabari in his Universal History, the Arab historian and geographer al-Mas'udi, that's also 10th century, the Arab geographer, cartographer, and advisor to Roger II, al-Idrisi, in the 12th century. And the latter, that is, al-Idrisi, mentioned Sarandib as, quote, a large and widely known island, the site of the mountain upon which Adam descended, end quote. He went on to describe the mountain and its environs in detail. The mountain had a lofty summit and a high peak that rose into the sky and could be seen by sailors from their boats when they were at a distance of several days' journey. The mountain was known as El Ruhun, and the Brahmins believed that Adam's footmark was imprinted in stone on its summit, and that a light permanently shone over the footprint. On and around the mountain, rubies and other types of precious stones were found, as were perfume-producing flora such as aloe wood. Rice, coconuts, and sugarcane grew there, while diamonds and crystals abounded in nearby rivers. So we see here that the site of Adam's fall dominated the landscape. Lofty and lit, it stood like a pillar beckoning from afar. Its slopes were abundant with beauty, sweet aromas, precious stones, and nourishing food, reminiscent of, or maybe perhaps offering a faint echo of, the paradise left behind. So the core features of this story relate to Adam's fall in Sarandib, so the location, and also his fall on a mountaintop. And there are all kinds of variations to this story, and the variations have to do mostly with where his companions fell. Because when he fell from paradise, he did not fall alone. So Eve fell with him, the snake fell, Iblis fell, and also the peacock, who was also an accomplice in the story. So their places of banishment sometimes vary, but Adam, or Nabi Adam as he is known in the sources, the prophet Adam, consistently found himself in Sarandib, banished from the riches and pleasures of paradise to a life of toil and pain for him and all his descendants thereafter. This story circulated far and wide and can be found in multiple textual sources in the Islamic world, including in South and Southeast Asia. So because I don't have much time, I'm not really going into the examples, neither from the Arab sources or from other sources in South and Southeast Asia, because I want to focus on the Sri Lankan Malay materials that are most closely, relevant. But I do want to emphasize that all of these other texts that recognize this story and discuss it and elaborate on it form the context and the background for what I'm going to say about Sri Lanka. I always have to choose if to say Sri Lanka or Sarandib or Ceylon, but you know what I mean. All of these places at once. So in an early 19th century Sri Lankan Malay compendium, when I say Sri Lankan Malay, I mean the Malay that was produced in colonial Ceylon, or in Sri Lanka rather than elsewhere. So this is a compendium, and what I want to show with these images is that you find in a book like this, many of the manuscripts in Sri Lanka are similar to this in that they will have texts in multiple languages, and even though they're all written in the Arabic script, this is Tamil, this is Arabu-Tamil, the one in the middle is Javanese, written in the Arabic script, and the one on the left is Arabic in the center, which is more in bold, you can see, and then a glossary in Malay. It's unusual to find all of these languages in one book, but to have at least two of them, or sometimes three, is quite common. But I'm focusing here again on a particular aspect of this manuscript. So in this compendium, the story of Adam's creation attributed to the son of Abbas was told at length as part of a sequence describing the prophets' lives. The well-known story of God sending the archangels to collect a handful of earth and bring it back so that God could create Adam is recounted. And the story goes that each one of these angels returned empty-handed because the earth resisted and didn't want to participate. Finally, Adam was created from earth gathered in several places and was infused with life. Despite Adam being warned of Iblis, of Satan, Iblis managed to enter paradise by trickery and tempted Eve, and she in turn Adam, with the fruit of the forbidden tree. They were banished, with Adam falling in Sarandib, Eve falling in Jeddah, the peacock fell in Hindustan, the snake in Isfahan, and Iblis in a place called Mazan. Many years and generations later, Ibrahim, that is Abraham, was Persia. Yeah. Everyone can connect to this. Ibrahim was commanded by God to build the Kaaba at the spot where, put to the test by God, he almost sacrificed his son Ismail. Again, a very well-known story. In the Jewish tradition, it's Isaac. In the Muslim tradition, it's Ismail. Ibrahim asked God where he should get the stones to erect the site, and God sent Jibril, the archangel, to bring them from 5 different mountains, including Mount Sarandib, so including the mountain where Adam fell to earth. In this account, Islam's holiest site, the Kaaba, was partly constituted from the rock of the mountain where Adam fell to earth. The account is in dialogue with the story of Adam's creation from earth, collected in several places, used to form the first human who would ultimately return to the earth, first via banishment and then upon death, while Adam's descendant Ibrahim would resituate the site of primordial exile at the heart of the Muslim world. Although it cannot be claimed with complete certainty, the names of the 4 other mountains, so he was told to bring earth from 5 different mountains, so the other 4 suggest they were located within the boundaries of what we now call the Middle East. This Mount Sarandib was a distant, displaced mountain in relation to the others, just as that same mountain was, quote-unquote, in exile from all other sacred pilgrimage sites located within Islam's heartlands. So there is something we could think of that particular mountain where Adam was banished or exiled to earth as itself in exile from the heartlands of the Muslim world. quote unquote, I don't know if it's in quotes or not, the heartlands. The stones which are said to have been brought to Mecca to be used in the creation of the Kaaba suggest a material link between Islam's most sacred of sites and Sarandib. The connection is reminiscent of the Javanese tradition that a handful of Mecca's earth was transported every Friday to Java by the 17th century king of central Java, Sultan Agung, eventually piling up to form the sacred hill at Imogiri, where Java's royalty have since been buried. So there's a very well-known tradition in Java that the king of Java in the 17th century would fly to Mecca every Friday after the prayers, bring a handful of the earth from Mecca back to Java, and gradually all of these handfuls turned into a large hill, and that's where the kings of Java have been buried since, and still to this day. So they are actually buried in the soil of Mecca, not in the soil of Java. In both cases, concrete earthly bonds were forged between the Islamic quote-unquote core and distant quote-unquote peripheries that located themselves within a universal sacred geography whose boundaries had been contested and expanded. And so there's the emphasis here in these stories is that there is a sort of back and forth, so it's never unidirectional, it's a dialogue or a dialectic. Although we don't have any kind of reflection by the 19th century author or scribe who wrote about Sarandib or the appearance of Sarandib and Mount Sarandib in this Malay manuscript produced in Ceylon, nonetheless a connection was made for the writer and for his audience in colonial Ceylon between the sacred sites of Adam's fall and the Kaaba, between Mecca and Sarandib, exiles of the distant and not so distant past. In another Sri Lankan Malay manuscript, this contains over 1,300 pages. This is like the largest book I've ever come across, maybe in my life. And it's filled with the popular tales of the prophets, Kisah al-Anbiya. Adam's biography took up several dozen pages, 17 of which focused explicitly on his relationship to Sarandib by occasionally mentioning it and tying Adam's actions to it. So every now and then the author goes back and mentions Adam left Sarandib, he came back to Sarandib, and describing his actions. The lengthy section dedicated to Adam begins with the same depiction, which I already noted, from of Adam falling in Sarandib and even Jeddah, etc. And Adam was commanded to go on the pilgrimage. While on his way, every place he passed turned into a flourishing settlement. Finally, he reunited with Eve, because they fell in different places, so in all of these stories it takes a while until they find each other. Stories followed, all of which have their roots in older traditions. So the angels complimenting Adam on his circumambulation of the Kaaba, Moses questioning Adam's decision to listen to Iblis while in paradise, and others. Eventually, Adam was commanded by God to return with Eve to Sarandib and fill the world with their progeny. In this instance, Adam was sent back to Sarandib, designating it not only as a site of banishment, but also a place of return and settlement. God's decree depicted it as a place of plenty, of fertility and growth, where the process of filling the world with humans would commence. Additional events unfolded, presumably in Sarandib, where Adam and Eve were living. Adam asked God for fire, and was taught by Jibril the craft of the ironsmith, which in the Malay world has special importance as a profession that combined technical expertise with spiritual powers, especially as related to producing the kris or the dagger. The children were born in pairs, always a boy and a girl, and eventually each married a spouse from a different pair of twins at a time when, according to the text, pregnancy and childbirth were painless. So this is disregarding the more common tradition, right, that Eve's punishment when she fell to earth was to bear children in pain, in misery. It was also a time when death was unknown, and next appeared the story of Qabil and Habil, so known in English as Cain and Abel, and the first murder, death, and burial. As it turned out, Adam was away on the Hajj when his beloved son Habil was killed by his envious brother, and so again the movement to and from Sarandib is explicit as Adam returns and searches for Habil, and the search for Habil is described. Finally, after weeping for 300 years for their dead son, the father and mother of humanity are said to have left Damascus, where they had been grieving, and returned one final time to Sarandib. This undated Sri Lankan manuscript offers a clear extension of Sarandib's presence within the traditional Islamic depiction of Adam's life. Sarandib first appears conventionally as the site of banishment from paradise, but is then reinserted into the narrative repeatedly as a reminder of Adam and Eve's earthly home, the place where they bore children and watched future generations come into being, where they knew prosperity and growth, but also the pain of loss and the original traumatic human encounter with death. Encapsulated in their Sarandib biographies is the full cycle of human life, from conception to birth to life and death, thus consolidating Sarandib's foundational role as a site in whose particular history all that would accompany humanity from Adam and Eve's time forward for all generations first transpired and was also first framed in Islamic terms. The site where Adam first touched down on earth is known in English as Adam's Peak, the summit of a lofty mountain that is visible from a great distance and whose peak casts a remarkable shadow at sunrise. So this is not the mountain, this is what you see from the top of the mountain at sunrise. It must have some kind of a, I don't know, physical or, the explanation of the light and the particular angles, but it's very striking. The peak is not associated with a single religion, but is sacred to several, pointing to the interconnectedness of belief, stories, and commemorative acts among religious communities living in close proximity. To the Buddhist, it is known as Sri Pada, marking the site of the Buddha's footprint left on one of his 3 visits to the island. The Hindus believe that it was Shiva or Vishnu who left the sacred trace. And there is even a Christian tradition that that the footprint there was left by Saint Thomas. And what you see here, besides this little boy who is my own private Adam, so I'm invested in the name and the figure in different ways. But what you see here is the different names written in different scripts and different languages. So the top one, I can't read. Does anyone read Sinhala here? It says Sri Pada, which is what the Buddhists call it, the Sri Pada, the footprint referring to the Buddha. The second one is Sivan Padam, which is the Tamil name for the Shiva's footprint, and Adam's Peak in English. We don't have the Malay on the sign, but it's sort of a concrete manifestation of how these different traditions, different religious traditions, and they are represented here by the different languages and the different scripts in the same site. Followers of all these religions have made the mountain into an important pilgrimage site, one that in the past was accessible only with great difficulty, as its elevated terrain was surrounded by dense forests. Even today, the 5,500 steps leading to its summit require patience and determination. But although there is much that is shared among the pilgrims of all these different faiths as they approach the mountaintop, and it's sacred to them all, it is only the Muslims who view it as a site of exile or banishment, where a pivotal event for all of humanity transpired. And this significance has been translated into an expansion of the core elements of Adam's story and its increasingly deep implantation into the Islamic imagination across genres and languages. The importance of this site is palpable, for example, in the account of Ibn Battuta, that great Muslim traveler who in the 14th century journeyed from his native Tangiers all the way to China. In 1340, Ibn Battuta's ship anchored in Ceylon, and he recounts how even when he was still 9 days away from the shore, he could already see the famous mountain towering in the distance. After arriving in the site of today's Puttalam, which is a little bit north of Colombo, and finding favor with the local king, he was asked to make a wish. And he replied, quote, "My only desire in coming to this island was to visit the blessed foot of our forefather Adam, whom these people call Baba," end quote. The wish was granted, and Ibn Battuta, accompanied by several yogis and Brahmins, set off for the mountain. He described a ridge with a cave and a well at the entrance to the mountain and continued, quote, "This mountain of Sarandib is one of the largest in the world. When we ascended it, we saw the clouds passing between us and its foot. There are also flowers of various colors, upon the leaves of which they think they can read the name of God and his prophet," end quote. He went on to depict a series of chains fastened to iron pins along the arduous path, with which those ascending could hold on to. Interestingly, the final chain was known as the chain of witness, because, Ibn Battuta explained, when one reached it and looked down, one was seized by the frightful notion that he was about to fall. Perhaps this last stage of the ascent and the view from above offered a reenactment of Adam's experience as he glanced down before his fall into this world. Certainly an ominous moment. According to custom, pilgrims at the time spent 3 days at the cave, visiting the footprint depressed in the rock morning and night. There they stood face to face with a concrete spot on earth where man first set foot, bewildered, afraid, and remorseful, having left behind the pleasures and certainties of heaven. The theme of banishment, so central to Adam's fall, appears especially relevant when we think of those contemplating this tradition in colonial Ceylon, exiles or their descendants. And so one source, in addition to the ones that I've already mentioned, but one that is more recent, that suggests a connection between different exilic eras and ordeals, is the 1904 Shair Faid al-Abad, written by the prominent Malay leader, publisher, and literary figure, Baba Unus Saldin. This small volume was written, as he states explicitly in the introduction, as a kind of way to convey to a younger Malay generation an understanding of the community's past. It included primarily depictions of battles in which the Malays took part in the service of empire, a section on mystical teachings, and some brief stories of the prophets. But it opened with what we might think of as a telegraphic, if anyone still remembers the telegraph, but a very concise history of the island prior to the arrival of the British. So I'm just going to show you the initial lines. And this is very brief, and after this there may be 5 or 6 more lines that describe the entire Portuguese and Dutch periods, and then the rest of the history is the history of the British, before it goes back to the short sections on mystical teachings and the prophet. So this island in the beginning was known as Sarandib. God sent down Adam to a mountaintop deep in the forest. Eve was sent down in Jeddah. Sometime later they met. Man and wife were delighted. They begat millions of children. Later it was known as Ceylon by name, its earth abundant with riches, completely inundated with treasures, pearls, and gems of many kinds. Okay, it sounds more poetic in Malay. This is a sort of a very literal translation, but it's really to show you the way that Baba Unus Saldin used these names. The island's history, according to the Shair is a very important genre of poetry in Malay. The island's history thus begins with Adam, first man and prophet, who was banished by God to the island, at the time known by its first or original name, Sarandib, and later to be called Ceylon. The reference to Adam's fall from paradise onto a mountaintop in Sarandib, recounted in those early sources I mentioned, highlights in the Shair's opening section Sarandib's status as the oldest original home on earth for the Malays, for all Muslims, and for humanity, via the sacred biography of Adam. It frames the Shair and gives its history, the history it tells, a temporal depth that extends far prior to and also beyond the history of colonialism, the latter which, although recounted in much greater detail, is but a fleeting and therefore less consequential than often perceived moment within a much greater narrative. Adam's fall on this particular mountaintop located Ceylon at the forefront of humanity's worldly existence, not just a place of exile where forsaken royals languish or a coveted possession for profit-hungry colonial administrators, as some may have perceived it, but the unique site where man first touched this earth and to which all humans ultimately trace their ancestry. Saldin's framing of the Shair was directed at his audience, the Malays in colonial Ceylon, eager to know more of their community's past. Retelling Adam's fall in Sarandib positioned the Malays' history in Ceylon as stretching back all the way to the dawn of humanity, and yet encompassing also more recent episodes of mobility and displacement between their ancestral and current homelands. Saldin's inclusion of Adam's fall at the start of this historical account also located his work within overlapping literary and historiographic traditions, including those of Arab and Persian historians, geographers, and travelers, writing in different locales and centuries, and formed a thematic and generic link with the wider networks of history writing in the Islamic world. Selden wrote of Ceylon's past both distant and more familiar to him personally from his own life and that of his elders. So I'm putting this aside for a minute, and I'm asking, what of the other shore? How did those who were not displaced or not exiled but remained in Java conceive of and imagine that island of banishment, whence rulers, relatives, or friends were sent away aboard Dutch ships, often never to return, and which coincided with the sight of Adam's fall to earth? And I'm going to address this by looking very briefly at one of the works of a poet by the name of Yasadipuro I, who lived from 1729 to 1802. And he was the court poet in Surakarta in central Java. And the work that I'm referring to is titled Serat Menak Serandil, and it offers an 18th century perspective on Ceylon, one that suggests how the island was understood and imagined from afar, in part through the familiar lens of Islamic and Javanese religious and literary models, including those related to Adam's biography. So this Menak, Serat Menak Serandil, Menak is more commonly known, I think, in other traditions as Amir Hamza. So some of you may know these stories. But in Java, he's known as Menak Amir Ambia, one of the Prophet Muhammad's uncles and a great warrior, traveler, and lover. And the tales about him became widely popular across the Indonesian archipelago since at least the 16th century. Adapted from Persian, they were known in Malay as the Hikayat Amir Hamza, and were among the Malay texts that were also known in Ceylon. The story told in Serat Menak Serandil, one of the volumes of the Javanese adaptation, is set, as the title implies, in Sarandib, and that's a Javanized form of Sarandib. And also, as in the Shair, the poem that I just showed, also here Sarandil and Ceylon or Ceylon are used interchangeably in the text. Here is found not an eyewitness account of the island, as in the case of Ibn Battuta, nor an allusion to exile in Ceylon as a personal or familial experience, as in the Shair. Set in the era of Islam's early expansion, the volume opens with the king of Ceylon, Sahal Shah, being unseated by a powerful rival. The deposed king turned to his allies and asked for help, and after some deliberations and back and forth, it was decided that Amir Hamza, or Menak, as he's known in Java, was the right person to assist. He and his men sailed closer to Ceylon's shoreline, and they saw a large mountain in the distance, and Menak asked the person who was guiding them about the mountain. And the reply was that this was Mount Serandil, and the man pointed Menak to a very large rock on the summit where Adam's footprint could be found. He added that many ship captains and kings visited the site and performed acts of devotion there. Menak asked to do the same, and so he and all of the companions who had sailed with him climbed to the top. Then everyone descended except for one person whose name was Umar Maya, who was a military general. He remained by the big rock, fell asleep, and had a dream in which 4 holy men came down from the sky. One of them was Nabi Adam, from whom Umar Maya requested a pusoko, which is a Javanese word referring to a sacred object often associated with royal regalia, such as a gong, a sword, or a saddle, which possesses special powers, and in the case of kings, because usually it's the kings who possess them, was both a condition for and also a symbol of their authority. Adam promised Umar Maya, Adam, that is in the dream, promised Umar Maya a pouch out of which anything he desired would emerge. Umar Maya then spoke to the second man in the dream, who turned out to be the Prophet Ibrahim, and he introduced himself as a Muslim, and Ibrahim promised him various boons as well. And the third and fourth celestial men turned out to be Isaac and Solomon, who also gave boons, which Umar Maya used to his and Menak's benefit later in the story. But the relevant point here is that, as in the other texts that I have spoken about, Menak Serandil shows knowledge of Adam's fall in Sarandib, also known as Ceylon. Moreover, beyond this accepted truth, the author Yasadipura was familiar with tales of the specific mountaintop and its fame as a pilgrimage site, a place to ask for blessings and miracles where direct access to the prophets was possible. And I also want to note that the same Yasadipura wrote a history of Java in the 18th century known as Babad Giyanti. And as part of this research, I've been looking for Javanese sources from that period who mention in any way or form exile to Ceylon. And that particular Babad, that particular history, has a very rare section, very hard to come by, this kind of an account where the memories of two women from the royal family who were exiled to Ceylon and who were able to return after over a decade are recounted. And some of the things that they talk about are the way that they had a circle of disciples, Muslim disciples, Javanese, but also others who were in Ceylon at the time, who studied with a guru whose name was Ibrahim Asmoro, so it sounds like a Javanese name. They studied together, they met for Friday prayers. And one of the things that the guru was able to do by virtue of his powers, special powers, was to bring in Javanese delicacies, Javanese fruit, Javanese food every Friday from faraway Java in order to please the disciples and in order to help them overcome the longing that they were feeling during the exile. So, and this is the same author who wrote the Menak Serandil. So what I want to ask here is, can depictions of Ceylon in this Babad Giyanti, which is a historical chronicle, be linked with those of Menak Serandil, which is part of a longer series of tales documenting the life of one of early Islam's greatest warriors? And I think that the answer is yes. Taken together, the two works show that Ceylon was on the poet Yasadipura's mind, that he made attempts to imagine and depict it, living as he did through a century of contemporary lived exile to Dutch Ceylon, including that of high-ranking members of the Surakarta Palace, where he himself served as court poet. Possessing at least some awareness of Ceylon's geography and sites facilitated the imagining of exiles in particular places or in proximity to sacred sites like Adam's Peak. The descriptions found in the Menak Serandil of ship captains coming from far and wide to express their devotion at the site of Adam's fall is echoed closely in the Babad Giyanti, in which ship captains from many a land encircle with reverence not the sacred stone but the Islamic guru Ibrahim Asmoro. The boons received by Umar Maya after four prophets descend from the sky and fulfill his wishes in a dream are reminiscent of the Javanese delicacies arriving every Friday to console the exiles' hearts, highlighting the miraculous in both texts. And there are other echoes between these two texts. How does nomenclature figure in the texts I've been discussing? In Menak Serandil and the Shair, Sarandib and Ceylon are both used as designations. Employing both suggests that when writing Menak, so that this Javanese poet, Yasadipura's literary imagination was informed by traditional Islamic tales as well as his view from Java on contemporary exile to Ceylon. Whereas he used Sarandib and Ceylon interchangeably, because in this story he sometimes used Sarandib and sometimes Ceylon, there doesn't seem to be any particular pattern. Baba Nusaldin in his Shair put forward a more quote-unquote developmental model. Sarandib, it claimed, was the original name for the island, its only images those of mountain and jungle, while later it came to be known as Ceylon, its land fertile and abundant with riches. And yet towards the end of the Shair, so that's really towards the end, after all of the military descriptions and the mystical teaching, at the very, very end, in the brief section narrating the Prophet's lives, Sarandib and Adam reappear. Saldin mentions again that Adam fell, quote, in the land called Sarandib in this world, and that he and Eve wept, indicating that landing in Sarandib and in this world was an experience filled with sorrow. And so, even if forested, desolate Sarandib became gem-filled Ceylon with time, the place where Malay history unfolded through battles, travel, and personal life, in closing, the Shair returned to the older name. It was, in Genet's terms, a paratext, a brief but crucial insertion which framed the poem on both ends, encased it with the figures of Adam and Eve, parents, vulnerable humans, exiles in a new land. The appellation Sarandib maintained its power, its hold on the imagination in colonial Ceylon, like an ancient pusoko, or one of these objects or heirlooms, summoned to caution and protect. And that power, or at least its remnants, this is very speculative, but maybe, that power, or at least its remnants, can still be felt in Sarandib's manifestation in the English language, in the form of the word serendipity, which was coined in 1754. Its inventor, Horace Walpole, who had read the Persian tale that, titled Three Princes of Serendip, wrote to a friend that those princes, quote, were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of, end quote. He called that ability they possessed serendipity, and the word has since come to designate an aptitude for making desirable discoveries by accident, as well as good fortune or luck more broadly. Its core meaning remains tied to finding the unexpected, to a search, a quest, an adventure. Although the more positive associations the word has acquired over time may not have fit the early exile's plight, the broader definition resonates with the exilic experiences of Adam as well as the Malays' forefathers, finding themselves in unexpected, unintended circumstances. Am I okay in terms of time? More or less.
Go to five past.
Okay. So, back to the Shair, back to this poem. By framing itself with Adam's fall, the Shair suggested that exile could also constitute a return. Adam's banishment from paradise signaled the end of that heavenly existence for all humans. And humans in Malay, in the Malay language, are known typically as anak cucu Adam, which means literally the children and grandchildren of Adam, so Adam's descendants. This seminal event formed a paradigm for all future exiles, including that of the Malays' ancestors, many of whom were banished from across the Indonesian and Malay archipelago. With Adam's story in mind, and with its appearance in the Shair's opening and closing sections, readers were reminded that the colonial power that exiled their community's forefathers had transported the Malays to the quintessential exilic site. The recognition that exile into Ceylon was not solely an expulsion, but also, via Adam's sacred biography, a return, was potent and comforting. It encouraged attempts at connecting, searching for roots in a foreign land, looking for ties to the site, and justifications for being there, affirming a sense of quote-unquote at-homeness that was congruent with the early exiles' experiences, but nonetheless offered sustenance and gradually, for subsequent generations, transformed into a lived reality. This later sentiment is clear as the Shair, this poem, through its pages, portrays mobility of many kinds, so for example via travel, enlistment, transmission, but it also makes palpable a sense of community, an attachment to place, the telling of a history that has connected Malays to their quote-unquote new home, a history that converges on Ceylon, but also highlighted Ceylon or Sarandib's status as the old, original home on this earth for the Malays and all humans as descendants of Adam. Throughout this talk, I've explored sources from various places, periods, and genres that engage with Adam's fall in Sarandib, and the way this tradition offered a framework for considering and experiencing exile to Ceylon in the colonial period, most pertinently under Dutch rule in the 17th and 18th centuries. The next and final source I want to briefly talk to you about is also, I think, the most heart-rending, and it also draws the clearest, most direct connection between the two episodes of Banishment. In 1724, a letter was received in Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta, from Tumenggung Surapati. Tumenggung is a title of nobility in the Javanese court. Tumenggung Surapati, a Javanese exile in Colombo, who wrote to his wife, children, and mother who had remained in Java. The letter was translated into Dutch, as was common practice at the time. So what you see here, and you can maybe see, I'm not going to subject you to my reading of Dutch, but you can see here the word, Mount Sarandib, the mountain where, on which Adam, who was punished by God. So this is the translation of the Javanese letter into Dutch, and we no longer have the originals, very unfortunately. The final section of the letter addressed to Surapati's mother read, and this is the translation. It's a very partial translation of this letter, but this is the relevant section for this talk. "O dear mother, wherever you may be, on whoever's side you are, together with our wives and children, be but careful and take care of yourself and also of your grandchildren, and trust in God with all patience, now that I am no longer by your side. I live here in the town called Colombo, on the coast, not far from Sarandib mountain, the mountain where Adam fled, where he had angered God, and stayed there separated from our mother Eva for some time, but was again, through the mercy of the highest God, after declaring his sins and praying for forgiveness, called upon and accepted in mercy and restored to his wife, which we must all take as an example, and hope that after fervent prayer we may again be brought together in eternity, which we all will beg of God and hope our pleas will be heard." End quote. So what I showed on the top, that's the section mentioning Sarandib and Adam. So there's important information in this brief passage, and also there's a Dutch note attached to it that's saying that Surapati was held in Colombo, and that he wrote in the Javanese language using the Pegon script, so he was using the Arabic script to write Javanese. But more pertinently, for my purposes, Surapati located himself in relation to Adam and his exilic fate. He described Colombo as a town on the shore, whereas inland to that coast stood Mount Sarandib, the only point in the landscape of the island that he took care to mention. He depicted the mountain as a place where Adam fled after angering God and, separated from Eve alone, declared his sins and prayed for forgiveness, which God ultimately granted. Surapati took Adam's plight explicitly as a model for his own. He was like Adam, having angered God and thus received the punishment of exile from his native land, separated painfully from the distant family he wrote to with such longing. He referred to Eve as quote-unquote mother, i.e. the mother of humanity, while writing to his own beloved mother, thus conflating the two, and he called on her to pray fervently as he would do too and beg before God with the hope of reuniting one day. Surapati did not dare expect a reunion that would soon transpire, which was what happened to Adam and Eve in the original story. He did not expect a return home and a meeting with his own Eve. All he felt he could aspire to was an eventual meeting in the afterlife. Surapati's letter, despite its brevity and the inaccessibility of the original, conveys the loneliness and pain of exile, but also the hope and resilience that Adam's example could provide. It offered comfort and inspiration and insight on an experience which, due to Adam's plight, was deeply ingrained in humanity. The ancient story of Adam's banishment from paradise to earth, a paradigm for all future banishments from original home to a strange land, from divine realm to human suffering, was deployed to frame and partially give meaning to exile to Ceylon, fostering connections and echoes that shaped the way Ceylon was experienced. For one, recalling Adam's fall shifted the temporal frame of political exile under colonial domination and located contemporary worldly events within a divinely determined chronology. It offered an alternative approach towards time and causality, putting colonialism's structures of authority and its durability and perspective within a much larger, even cosmic framework. Referencing Adam put Ceylon on the map, thus adding a spatial dimension to those of meaning and time, no longer just a God-forsaken place of exile, but home to the important Islamic sacred site of Adam's Peak, itself somewhat quote-unquote exilic in its location, far from the Middle East, yet according to some traditions, its rocks contributing to the structure of the Kaaba. The important site and the possibility that their arrival in Ceylon was not only banishment, but also a return, introduced some measure of familiarity to a foreign land in which, over time, the Malays established a new home. In considering Adam and Sarandib, the link to place was further strengthened by the Hebrew etymology of Adam's name and its relationship to the word for earth, which is Adama, the feminine form of Adam, which means human or man, highlighting not only the trope of paradigmatic exile, but also that of belonging, of an acquired attachment to place, be it the post-paradise human world or specifically Ceylon. That is the official end of my talk, but I can't resist just showing you saying just one or two sentences about the other literary religious tradition that I couldn't talk about today for lack of time, but which in some ways is parallel to this one, and in some ways is also very different, and that is the Ramayana. And what you see here is a page from the Hikayat Sri Rama, which is the very widely known Ramayana in Malay, popular in Southeast Asia, but this is a manuscript from colonial Ceylon. And the Ramayana is a tradition, a literary religious tradition that has been and still is in some ways very popular for the Muslims in Southeast Asia. I think not so much in South Asia. I would be very happy to be contradicted, and if anyone has other examples. But what you see here is a Ramayana written in the Arabic script, and I chose the page randomly, but then I looked at it more closely, and this is the part where it's talking about Jatayu, the bird, the bird Jatayu, who fell to the ground after trying to rescue Sita and from Ravana, and he's badly wounded, and he's lying on the ground. And what you see here, if you can see those dots on the bottom, this is a pantun, which, like the shair, is a very popular form of Malay poetry, and the entire Ramayana is interspersed with these poems. And here Jatayu is, it's his poem. He's expressing himself through poetry, praying and asking hoping to come across Rama before he dies, so that Rama can know the direction in which Sita was kidnapped. So the story is very familiar. But again, it's told within a Muslim community. It's written in the Arabic script, and what I want to end with is that Adam, or Nabi Adam, who I spent the last hour talking about in this other tradition, appears as a figure within this Ramayana and as a character. He's not a main character, but he does appear here and there in very significant moments, including in the opening lines, really, not only the opening pages, the opening lines of this story, where after he was banished from paradise and he finds himself on the top of Mount Sarandib, he's wandering around and he runs into Ravana, who was also banished to the top of the mountain by his grandfather. And that's actually the beginning, the very beginning of the Malay Ramayana, that meeting, that moment. So thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
You need people to ask questions in the microphone. So there is a mic that will go around, and we have maybe about half an hour or so.
Thank you so much, Ronit. Very rich and textured as your previous work, so I really appreciated that. I was wondering, as you were talking and emphasizing exile and belonging, what the purchase was for you, because I kept thinking about genealogy and kinship and location, which you kind of ended with, in the sense, because it's like, it seems to me like these are texts where time and space are negotiated. There's that whole struggle and survival that a lot of these texts act as witnesses for, right? Could be really a place to think also about witnessing, about location, about this movement between, or the need actually to have earth, right, transported between a place like Mecca and Lanka. And so I just wondered, so what if, and that may be also part of your thinking, because at the end you did bring in time and space, so what sort of, what if the analytics get a little bit mixed up or inverted? Is there a purchase to it?
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what you mean exactly by that? Is there a purchase to it?
Well, to think about a lot of, well, what does it do analytically for your work, for these fragments in a way, to come together, for your narrative actually to be a narrative with less missing spots? Or
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I have to think about it a bit, but I guess, you know, ever since I started this project, and that was longer than, you know, I didn't expect it to expand the way it has. So I've been looking at these materials probably for 5 or 6 years. And I always keep coming back to this question of exile and the banishment. Even though you could think about the history and literary culture of the Sri Lankan Malays from various other angles, for sure. You could think more about religion. You could think more about, I mean, there's a lot of room for anthropologists to study this community. There are all kinds of things that you can do. And for me, somehow, I keep coming back to that. And, you know, the question of why is, I always think that these research questions are also about the personal. You know, they're never completely divorced from who you are and your circumstances or your, but that for me has sort of trying to choose how to tell this story, how to write a book about the Sri Lankan Malays. What will be the thread? You know, what will be the story that I want to tell as opposed to other possibilities? I find myself, you know, drawn to this particular angle, but I also think that for me it's very interesting how these other traditions, you know, including most visibly the Ramayana and the story of Adam, have in some ways focused their attention on this particular site. It also, you know, it may not be a coincidence that they're both focused on that site. I mean, there could also be a history of connections and influences. But the way these traditions have come to us, sort of, for me, it's very interesting how that connects then with the later exile. I don't think I'm really answering your question, but...
so why not kinship and genealogy?
Yeah.
I guess a simple question would be that.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is also the materials that are available as opposed to the ones that are not, because I've spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka, you know, talking to people, talking to the descendants. Of course, you know, when talking to people today, you get a very, you know, particular view of the past, you know, and it's not. But very few people actually have a sort of a sense of their descent, because for one thing, it's been a very long time, but also because so many of the people who were sent away from Java or from Sulawesi or from Sumatra, many of them were convicts or servants, and some of them were, you know, came as soldiers. The royal exiles, although they sort of loom large, they were a minority, and even the people who are descended from the most important, you know, people from the or families of the 18th century don't really have a sense of it. So in terms of actually tracing genealogy or kinship, Adam does. Adam is the, you know, the forefather. In more sort of concrete terms, it's a lot harder to do that. So Adam sort of fills that place. That's what one of the things I'm trying to say, you know, that they're returning to this place where the father lived, had his children, and such.
I want to ask a question, and in no way do I mean to put you on the spot, which probably means I do mean to put you on the
okay.
spot.
I'm used to it.
But you're such a wizard with these texts and things. You really are. That I'm going to ask it anyway. And it's about an island. When you have an island like Sri Lanka, quite often exile is pictured and understood through the sea, not through mountains. And so I'm wondering why the mountain? Why? It's a strange thing. I mean, why hasn't Adam, why don't all these books decide that Adam has come on a ship from a strange
Noah's
place?
Ark, that's a different story.
Yeah, something like it. No, I mean it actually.
Yeah.
What is it, when an island which tends to think of far away almost entirely in terms of its isolation by water, basically, when an island focuses on a mountain, it's a fascinating thing, and I'm wondering what Well, I'm just inviting you to think about that, actually.
Yeah. But an island does seem to you like a reasonable place to be exiled to, right?
Oh, sure. But
Yeah.
by sea, it's always by sea. And so
Oh, you mean not via
not
the
falling
mountain,
onto a mountain. And
Mhm.
so the whole role of the mountain becomes sort of fascinating when you think about it in that way. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. That you've thought about these texts for a long time and so on.
No, I'm going to have to think about it. I mean, there is an axis. There is this top-down, like when you think of Adam's story, there is this top-down axis, like falling from the sky to the earth on the mountain. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the mountain, you know, is closer to heaven. I mean, one of the traditions says that of all the mountains in the world, Mount Sarandib is the closest to paradise. So when Adam fell and he was standing on it, his feet were on the mountain, but his head was still in paradise and he could hear the angels singing. So he was sort of in a liminal space. So it may be that, you know, it's too much to fall all the way to the ground. But you do have that axis, and then you have the, when he is searching for Eve, because he falls in Sarandib, but she falls elsewhere and he's looking for her. Then he crosses over to South India, according to these, at least the stories in South and Southeast Asia. And then you have the bridge, and that same bridge, which is called Adam's Bridge, which goes from the north of Sri Lanka to Rameshwaram in Southeast India, is also the bridge in the Ramayana. Again, it's another connection between these traditions. That's the bridge that the monkeys build in order for Rama to cross over with his army to save Sita. So that's a sort of like, this is top down and this is, you know, across the sea. So, but it's a very interesting question. Yeah, I'll think about it some more. You have an idea? You have an answer?
Yeah, the two traditions, the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition is horizontal.
Is?
Horizontal. It's the fall takes place between ancient Mesopotamia, where allegedly the Garden of Eden was, and whichever other place. In Islam, it's a fall. It's vertical. That's why the feet
But both
touch.
Abraham and Moses climbed mountains to get close to the deity,
Which mountain did Abraham climb?
to sacrifice Isaac.
Oh, yeah. There you go. But I mean,
No,
but
your point's still about Adam. Still
like, it would be a Jewish boat to take you to banishment, and an Islamic fall from heaven.
That's very helpful.
This probably could solve this problem.
I think at least from what I tried to find out more about the Jewish tradition of Adam, and it's definitely not as important from what I could find out as it is in the Islamic tradition.
I think we are also misled by the English word fall.
Descent,
The fall
yeah.
from, not banishment from.
Yeah.
So like when you are banished, it's horizontal. Dante was banished from Florence to some other place. Devil's Island, banishment. But the whole sense of falling, that's where the mountain comes in.
Yeah, but also because we imagine heaven or paradise to be right. I mean, that's it's also our image of
Upstairs.
where in space it was or is. Yeah.
That's precisely why I'm not going to use it.
Okay.
There-
Lee, I'm going to ask you to use the
I am not
microphone.
going to use it for Rita. It's a violation of my freedom of speech, and that's another topic. I resent this. But this is an incredible talk, and it's rich, and some things have to be said. I have two questions that are kind of relating to larger context, and some of it's methodological, because you are focusing on a single community, and yet you start by showing us that these place and these stories relate to so many other communities. One is just a comment on the nomenclature, and this strikes me, especially in relationship to the context of your earlier work and Islam translated within Shelley Pollack's Sanskrit Cosmopolis. one of the points that Pollock makes in talking about the Sanskritic world, which overlaps your world pretty precisely, is how names and places just repeat. They're not unique. So there's many Ayodhyas and there are many Ganges, and they're just so you can have many names for the same place, but you can have many places with the same name. And the way in which this is not happening in your story seems significant. There is just one mountain. There is just one Sarandib. We don't have others. So there's some disjuncture. I mean, I'm just trying. I'm kind of relating the cosmopolis, which your work, the previous study and this study, are just creating a world for scholars to think anew in this kind of Southeast Asian, Islamic. That this is one feature in terms of what a name is in relation name and place. That if you look at the other traditions, they don't. Buddhists and Hindus have repeat names and places. That's just an observation. But the other comment is, okay, they're exiled, and you're seeing them in their own terms and in relating to the tradition that the Malays identify with, and it's a large and rich one. But this is also Sripada. These are Muslims in a Buddhist place. They're relating to this, and I mean, both because the headlines in the news today just are not too far away of what's going on, and we don't see, at least in what you've shown us, any of the relations of of Adam's Peak to Sripada and the Buddhist world that once the colonial context, because your earlier presentation here showed us how the 18th, 19th century Dutch British colonial side of that. Once that's there, I mean, so I just want, can we really understand them and what exile means only in the Islamic terms and not in the relational terms to this similar?
So first, your first question, I think it's a really interesting observation. One of the things that interests me is the connections between these names. I mean, I didn't talk about it much, but I said, in the Shire and also in the Menak from Java, you do see an overlap, at least between Ceylon and Sarandib. They are either interchangeable or they are, come in sequence, one after the other. It's a lot harder to find Lanka overlapping with, especially with Sarandib.
And Lanka outside of Hindu texts?
Well, is this the question is this a Hindu text, for example? No, so I think this is the only place where I could find Lanka Puri or Lanka and Sarandib, but it's unusual, and you try to, one of the questions for me starting out with this was, did people, at least in their imagination, I'm not talking now about people who actually were there, but if we think more of the realm of the imagination, did people actually connect these different places when they thought about them, or was Lanka one place where this story, unfolded, and Sarandib was a different place, and Ceylon was the real sort of 18th century land of politics and banishment and difficulty and adjustment, and that's still, it's not always clear. It's not always clear. Even a poet, Yasadipuro, this Javanese poet, I think is very unusual and is a very interesting case because, like I said, he wrote the history of Java where he talks about the real exile. I mean, you can say that the transmission of Javanese fruit every Friday to Lanka is not a real event, but depends how you look at it. But he was writing about real exile. He was writing about Ceylon and Sarandib in this history of Amir Hamza. But the third thing that he wrote, which again I didn't have time to go into, but he wrote a Javanese Ramayana in the 18th century. He wrote an adaptation in modern Javanese of the Kawi work, of the old Javanese work. So he's a single person who was writing it in the same time, and obviously it's him writing about these three, I don't even know exactly what to call them, these three incarnations or these three understandings of a single place. But besides this example that I showed where he's talking about Ceylon and Sarandib and it's in a mythic past, you don't really see an overlap or a connection. You know, so it's sort of like an open question how much these places were really connected. And when I say really, again, I don't necessarily mean in the, you know, concrete sense, but in the way people imagined and thought about these places and what their significance was. But also about what you said, you know, that there's only one Lanka, there's only one Sarandib. There's at least one source that I've found where a convict from, I'm pretty sure from South India, who was sent, this is probably early 19th century, sent to Penang, which is now in Malaysia, is talking and then coming back home, and he's talking about his experiences there. He's talking about his Lanka. So even though he was actually in Penang as a convict worker and you know, serving a term of prison or hard labor, when he came back, he spoke about his Lanka, not about Penang. So that's very interesting. It's very hard to track down these references, but it shows us something about people imagining, you know, and he was from India. I mean, I'm assuming he was. No, yeah, and I think if you think about, you know, Hindu communities and exile or diaspora, I think that these images of the Ramayana in Lanka, you will find them. And the other, right, the relationship to the Buddhists. That's a very important question, and I haven't, you know, done enough about that. But I agree with you. I don't think we can understand we certainly can't understand the story of the 18th century exile in 19th century enlistment and life in colonial Ceylon without connecting more to the, you know, broader society in which they were living, even though I think in many cases at that time at least, you know, they were living sort of in many cases in separate, not entirely separate from these other communities, but quite separately. Especially in the 19th century, there were many of them lived in military, you know, encampments with their families, and had their own mosques and their own schools, etc., etc. I mean, even today, there is still a lot of tension when, because of their shrinking numbers, a mosque that used to be considered a Malay mosque and the sermons were always in Malay is taken over by Tamil-speaking Muslims, and they become the majority. So I think there was also, you know, quite an enclosed existence, but it's very important to look more into that. I need to learn Sinhala because it's a real barrier. Yes, Farina?
So that does bring up, I mean, thank you for this talk and the beautiful way that you are threading various traditions together. But your last comment makes me think, so you started out by talking about a broader Islamic tradition, right? How this story of Sarandib is there in among geographers, right? Basically Muslim geographers, from what I could tell from the list you gave us. But I guess now I'm wondering about, and you focused, for obvious reasons, your attention on Malay Muslims, but you've now brought up the Tamil Muslims. And I guess the question is, and it's an unfair question because you're not necessarily studying them, but is the extent to which this is a trope of belonging for Tamil Muslims who could very easily also have similar notions of banishment, perhaps, or exile, right? And so which would also, if it is or isn't, it would also help us think about the specificity of the way it works for Malays. So I'm wondering if you know anything about that side of the equation.
That's a really, really good question, and I don't know whether within the Tamil Muslim community there is was a similar kind of understanding of this story. I mean, I know this story is known and there are various, works in Tamil that relate this, but I'll look into it. What I do know is, what I've been able to find out is that, you know, the popularity of the Ramayana within the Tamil Muslim community is nothing like it is among the Malays. I mean, for the Malays, I'm pretty sure that the Malays brought this, you know, very strong attachment to the story of the Ramayana from Southeast Asia, where it's so widespread and it's so important. And I even emailed you, right, asking you a few months ago.
I remember the question.
Yeah.
I understand the context much better. So.
Yeah, I emailed Farina, and I emailed a few other, you know, scholars who work on Islam in South Asia to see if maybe there was something huge that I was missing, that I wasn't seeing, that I didn't know about, in terms of an attachment to the Ramayana among Muslims in South Asia. And so far, again, if anyone knows anything about this, I'm very, very happy to be contradicted or to learn something new. But as far as I can tell, there is nothing that's similar to the way the Ramayana has been incorporated into Muslim life. I mean, it was there before Islam. It's not that it was incorporated. Islam has been incorporated into societies where the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were very, very important, and they remained very important. And this is sort of the part of the evidence for that, also in performative traditions. So as far as the Tamil Muslims in Sri Lanka or in South India are concerned, I don't think there's anything similar to this. But in terms of Adam, I will look into it.
Well, you're one of the few people in the world who most probably has the skill set to actually do that too, to give us insights, you know, into between these two traditions, right? So now it becomes the 10-year project. So we'll maybe make this the last question.
Sure. Okay. This is a question about the tension between exile and pilgrimage, because you did mention that ship captains came and performed pilgrimage, and I'm very, very interested in that, because many pilgrimage traditions are actually structurally and procedurally quite similar. What did the sea captains do? You know, they walked to the top of the mountain. There was something on the mountain. Somebody blessed somebody. And in typical pilgrimage traditions, excuse me, you come away with an object. You know, you go to Compostela, you return with a scallop shell. You do the Buddhist pilgrimage, you return with things. And I was wondering if there was tension between, or if there was a regular pilgrimage tradition for, say, the Malay community. At a certain time of year, did they hike to the top of the mountain? Yeah, we may never know, but I wondered if you have come across anything.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a particular time of year. I don't think so for the Adams Peak, but pilgrimage is, in general, you know, sacred sites are very important for the Malays in Sri Lanka, and also just, you know, in the wider Malay world. And there's a whole set of sacred tombs, so not necessarily Adam's, you know, footprint, which is also important, but there's a whole set of these sacred tombs. Also, by the way, in Cape Town, Danny, there's a whole set of Malay sacred tombs where people go, you know, will go in pilgrimage, and each one has its own, you know, rites and story.
It's part of the reason why they can't build on the mountain, why the camp's base side is empty of houses, because there was a court case, actually. A great friend of mine was the judge, called Dennis Davis. And Dennis Davis judged that you can't build because it's unknown where some of the tombs are, and so at any point you could be building on Muslim.
And that would be, yeah. Yeah, so I'm not sure, you know, in the text that I mentioned, like when they say that the ship captains came from far and wide, they only use the word bhakti, you know, from bhakti, which means just to perform bhakti, but there's no description. But this whole question, you know, of these devotions and the dreams and the visits to sacred tombs, and I mean, these are very important components in Sri Lankan Malay culture. and you know, how they're connected to this history of exile and banishment, how much of, I mean, because these are also, you know, paths of connection, right? Because if you can see your ancestors from Java in a dream, or if the food comes every Friday, or, I mean, these are ways of connecting back and forth and journeying back and forth, even without, you know, actually going. Yeah. So I think it's it is an important aspect of their culture that needs more research. I mean, many of the things that I mentioned, you know, some of them I mentioned in passing because I didn't have enough time, but some of them I mentioned in passing because there just is very, very little research, and I certainly haven't done it. And if anyone here is a graduate student looking for a dissertation topic, or if anyone has students, I'm very serious. I mean, this is a community in the history that is very, very fascinating in all kinds of ways, and it just needs more people to explore it, you know, from an anthropological perspective, historical, whatever, religious studies. So I'm trying to sell you the idea. Thank you very much.
On that note, let us thank Ronit.